Welcome to History Teller YT, where we bring the past to life one story at a time. Today, we're diving into one of the most significant yet often overlooked conflicts of the 20th century, the Korean War, often called the Forgotten War. Between 1950 and 1953, the Korean Peninsula became a battleground not just for North and South Korea, but for global powers including the United States, China, and the Soviet Union. This war shaped modern geopolitics, divided a nation, and left millions of lives forever changed. From the first North Korean invasion, through dramatic battles like the Inchon Landing and the bloody stalemates along the 38th parallel, to the eventual armistice that created the demilitarized zone, we'll uncover the full story, the military strategies, the international politics, the human suffering, and the lasting legacy that continues to affect the Korean Peninsula today. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this war, despite being forgotten by many, remains one of the most important events of the Cold War era. So grab a seat, because History Teller YT is taking you on a journey through the full story of the Korean War, from start to finish. Before the first shots were fired in 1950, Korea had already endured decades of turmoil, colonization, and national division. The Korean Peninsula, strategically located between China, Japan, and Russia, had long been an arena for imperial ambitions. In 1910, Japan formally annexed Korea, initiating a brutal colonial period that would last until the end of World War II in 1945. During these 35 years, the Korean people endured forced labor, cultural suppression, and economic exploitation. Japanese authorities sought to erase Korean identity, banning the Korean language in schools and replacing traditional customs with Japanese ones. Koreans resisted in many forms, from underground nationalist movements to guerrilla actions, but these efforts were often met with severe repression. As World War II came to an end, Korea's future became entangled with the emerging Cold War. The defeat of Japan left a power vacuum on the peninsula. In the immediate aftermath, the Allies divided Korea along the 38th parallel, a line that was originally intended as a temporary administrative measure. The Soviet Union occupied the north, while the United States occupied the south. This artificial division was initially meant to be temporary, but ideological differences and emerging geopolitical tensions soon hardened the split. The North, influenced by the Soviet Union, embraced communism under Kim Il-sung, while the South, under Syngman Rhee, established an anti-communist state with support from the United States. The stage was set for a confrontation that would soon escalate into full-scale war. By 1948, two separate governments had been formally established: the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, and the Republic of Korea, South Korea. Each claimed sovereignty over the entire peninsula, fueling border clashes and political tension. Both sides were determined to reunify Korea under their respective governments. But the Cold War's broader ideological divide ensured that compromise was unlikely. These early years were characterized by political purges, ideological indoctrination, and preparations for conflict. The stage was set for what would become one of the most devastating wars of the 20th century, a conflict whose consequences are still felt in modern geopolitics. To fully understand the Korean War, one must examine the global context of the early Cold War. The world had emerged from World War II into a period defined by ideological struggle between two superpowers: the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union. This rivalry was no longer limited to Europe, where the Berlin blockade and the division of Germany were already signaling conflict, but had now expanded into Asia. Korea, caught between these powers, became a critical chess piece in the global struggle. The U.S. viewed Korea as a critical line in containing the spread of communism in Asia. The Truman administration, adhering to the policy of containment, saw a communist takeover of Korea as unacceptable. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, recovering from the devastation of World War II, sought to expand its influence in East Asia without risking direct confrontation with the United States. Stalin encouraged the North Korean leadership to unify the peninsula under communism but was cautious about provoking a larger war. At the same time, China was undergoing its own revolution, and the victory of the Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong in 1949 added another layer of complexity. These international dynamics transformed what could have been a regional conflict into a global flashpoint. Both superpowers supplied weapons, advisors, and political support to their respective Korean allies. For the North, Soviet tanks, aircraft, and military strategy were crucial. For the South, American military and financial aid strengthened its defense. What may have begun as a Korean Civil War quickly evolved into a Cold War battleground, with the entire world watching. The stage was set, and the pieces were moving into position for a war that would reshape East Asia and the global order for decades to come. The years between 1948 and 1950 saw increasing tension along the 38th parallel, as both North and South Korea prepared for what they viewed as inevitable conflict. Border skirmishes became more frequent, and both sides conducted military raids into each other's territory. The North, equipped with Soviet tanks, artillery, and aircraft, began building a powerful military machine, preparing for a potential invasion. Meanwhile, South Korea relied heavily on U.S. support, including training programs, advisors, and equipment, but remained militarily weaker and politically unstable. The ideological battle between communism and capitalism intensified political violence within both Koreas. In the South, Syngman Rhee's government suppressed leftist movements and targeted suspected communist sympathizers, leading to widespread arrests and executions. In the North, Kim Il-sung consolidated power by purging political rivals and promoting communist ideology, often using violent measures to eliminate dissent. Both governments claimed to represent the true Korea and began preparing for a war of reunification. By mid-1950, these tensions reached a breaking point. The North Korean leadership, confident in Soviet support and their growing military strength, planned a full-scale invasion of the South. The North believed that a swift campaign would allow them to seize Seoul and unify Korea under communist rule before significant international intervention could occur. What followed would be the outbreak of a conflict that came to be known as the Forgotten War, drawing in the United States, China, and eventually other nations under the United Nations banner. This war would leave an indelible mark on Korea, shaping the peninsula's political, social, and military landscape for decades. On the morning of June 25, 1950, the fragile tensions along the 38th parallel erupted into a full-scale war. In a surprise attack, approximately 75,000 North Korean troops, backed by Soviet tanks and artillery, crossed the border into South Korea. This invasion was meticulously planned, aiming to quickly overwhelm the South Korean forces and capture the capital, Seoul, within days. The North's strategy relied on speed, surprise, and superior firepower, particularly their Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks, which the South Korean army had little experience combating. South Korean defenses were unprepared for the sudden assault. The Republic of Korea Army, numbering only around 100,000, was poorly equipped, lacked modern armor, and suffered from limited training. Within hours, North Korean forces advanced rapidly, capturing key towns and transportation routes. Civilians were caught in the chaos, with thousands fleeing southward in panic, seeking safety from the invading forces. The South Korean government, led by Syngman Rhee, scrambled to organize a defensive response, but the speed of the North Korean advance made coordinated action nearly impossible. Within 3 days, the North Koreans reached Seoul, forcing the South Korean government to retreat. The fall of the capital marked a critical turning point, demonstrating the vulnerability of South Korea and signaling the seriousness of the conflict to the international community. The United States, having anticipated potential aggression but not the scale or timing of the invasion, quickly moved to intervene. President Harry S. Truman authorized the deployment of American forces under the United Nations flag, framing the conflict as a critical test in the fight against the spread of communism. The Korean War had officially escalated into an international crisis, with consequences that would reverberate far beyond the peninsula. The North Korean invasion prompted one of the first major military actions undertaken by the United Nations. On June 27, 1950, the UN Security Council passed a resolution condemning the attack and calling for member states to provide military assistance to South Korea. Notably, the Soviet Union was absent from the council at the time, having been boycotting the UN over the issue of China's representation. This absence allowed the resolution to pass, opening the door for international intervention. American forces, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, were rapidly deployed to the peninsula, although initial numbers were small and units were scattered. These early U.S. troops faced severe challenges: inadequate supplies, insufficient knowledge of the terrain, and a South Korean military in disarray. Despite these difficulties, American and South Korean forces established a defensive perimeter around the southeastern port city of Pusan, known as the Pusan Perimeter. Here, the UN coalition would make a desperate stand, buying time for reinforcements and preparing for a counteroffensive. The global significance of the Korean conflict quickly became clear. The United States viewed the war as a critical front in containing communism, while other nations, including the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and Turkey, contributed troops and logistical support. For many countries, participation was framed as both a moral obligation and a strategic necessity in the new Cold War order. This collective response transformed what might have remained a regional civil war into a truly international confrontation, setting a precedent for UN military action and solidifying Korea's place at the center of global politics during the early Cold War. The first months of the Korean War were marked by brutal fighting and staggering civilian suffering. North Korean forces, confident and well-equipped, pushed relentlessly southward. The South Korean military, bolstered by a few U.S. units, struggled to mount an effective defense. Cities, villages, and infrastructure were devastated as artillery, airstrikes, and infantry assaults swept across the peninsula. Refugees poured into safer areas, particularly around Pusan, creating humanitarian crises as food, shelter, and medical supplies became scarce. One of the earliest significant confrontations occurred in the Battle of Chosin in late July 1950, where U.S. forces faced the North Korean Army's superior tanks and firepower. Despite heroic resistance, the Americans were pushed back, revealing the formidable challenge ahead. These early defeats highlighted the urgent need for strategic innovation and coordination. General MacArthur began planning bold maneuvers, including the famous Inchon Landing, a risky amphibious operation designed to outflank the North Korean army and retake Seoul. Amid the chaos of war, the Korean population bore the heaviest burden. Tens of thousands were killed or wounded, homes destroyed, and communities torn apart. The conflict forced ordinary Koreans to navigate a war zone where allegiances, survival, and political ideology became matters of life and death. These early months set the tone for a war defined not only by military strategy but by the immense human cost, demonstrating that the Korean War would be remembered not just as a battle between nations, but as a profound human tragedy affecting millions across the peninsula. By August 1950, the situation in South Korea was dire. North Korean forces had advanced almost to the southeastern corner of the peninsula, confining UN and South Korean troops to the Pusan Perimeter. Supplies were limited, morale was low, and the possibility of a North Korean victory seemed imminent. It was during this critical period that General Douglas MacArthur, the commander of UN forces in Korea, proposed a bold and highly risky plan. An amphibious assault on the port city of Inchon, located near Seoul on the western coast. The Inchon operation was considered highly dangerous for several reasons. Inchon had extremely high tidal variations, which limited the window for ships to approach safely. The surrounding terrain included narrow channels and heavily fortified positions, giving the defenders a significant advantage. Furthermore, Inchon was deep behind enemy lines, meaning that if the landing failed, the UN forces could be cut off entirely. Critics of the plan, including some senior military advisors, warned that it could lead to disaster. Yet MacArthur was confident that a surprise attack, executed with precision and boldness, could turn the tide of the war. Extensive preparations were undertaken. Amphibious ships, naval artillery, and air support were coordinated to ensure maximum impact. South Korean and American forces trained rigorously, rehearsing landings and urban combat in conditions meant to mimic Inchon. Intelligence efforts focused on enemy fortifications, troop movements, and potential obstacles. MacArthur's vision relied on speed, deception, and surprise. The North Koreans would not expect an attack from the west, assuming their focus remained on the Pusan front. The Inchon Landing was not just a military maneuver, it was a high-stakes gamble that could define the outcome of the war. On September 15, 1950, the UN forces launched the Inchon Landing, known as Operation Chromite, with an unprecedented combination of amphibious assault, naval bombardment, and airstrikes. Thousands of soldiers, supported by tanks and artillery, stormed the beaches under heavy enemy fire. Despite challenging tidal conditions and fortified positions, the landing was executed with remarkable precision. The North Korean defenders, surprised and unprepared for an assault from this direction, were quickly overwhelmed in several key areas. The operation's success was immediate and dramatic. UN forces rapidly moved inland, securing Inchon and preparing for the march toward Seoul. The landing not only provided a crucial beachhead, but also threatened the rear of the North Korean army, forcing them to divert forces away from the Pusan Perimeter. Within days, the UN forces had begun liberating areas that had been under North Korean control for months. The psychological impact was equally significant. Morale among UN and South Korean troops soared, while North Korean units faced disarray and panic. MacArthur's boldness was vindicated. The Inchon Landing is now considered one of the most audacious and successful amphibious operations in military history. It demonstrated the power of planning, coordination, and strategic surprise, proving that even in desperate situations, bold initiatives could shift the momentum of war. Inchon became a turning point, marking the beginning of the North Korean retreat and opening the door for the recapture of Seoul, which had been under enemy occupation since June. Following the success at Inchon, UN and South Korean forces advanced toward Seoul, the capital city, in late September 1950. Urban warfare posed significant challenges. North Korean troops had fortified key positions, set up barricades, and laid mines throughout the city. Street-to-street and building-to-building fighting ensued, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Civilians, many of whom had remained in the city under occupation, were caught in the crossfire, exacerbating the humanitarian crisis. Despite fierce resistance, UN and South Korean forces gradually pushed through the city, aided by superior firepower, air support, and tactical coordination. By September 28, 1950, Seoul was officially recaptured. The liberation of the capital was a major symbolic and strategic victory, signaling to the world that the North Korean advance had been halted. For the North Koreans, the loss of Seoul forced a hasty retreat northward, creating chaos in their ranks and overextended supply lines. Tens of thousands of prisoners and abandoned equipment were left behind, further weakening their military capacity. The recapture of Seoul demonstrated the transformative effect of decisive, well-executed operations in war. It also highlighted the complex interplay between military strategy and civilian impact, as liberated populations struggled to recover from months of occupation. Yet, even as UN forces celebrated, the broader picture remained uncertain. The North Korean army was not yet defeated, and MacArthur's ambition to push further north into enemy territory would soon bring the conflict to a dramatic and controversial phase. Inchon and Seoul marked the end of North Korea's initial offensive, but the war was far from over. Following the successful Inchon Landing and the recapture of Seoul, United Nations and South Korean forces gained significant momentum. Buoyed by victory and encouraged by MacArthur, UN troops began pushing northward beyond the 38th parallel, aiming to liberate the entire Korean peninsula. By October 1950, UN forces had crossed into North Korean territory, advancing rapidly toward the Yalu River, which forms the border with China. The North Korean army, weakened by earlier defeats and stretched thin, struggled to regroup. The UN advance into North Korea was marked by optimism but also significant logistical and strategic challenges. The terrain was harsh and unfamiliar, with mountainous regions, rivers, and limited infrastructure complicating supply lines. The North Korean army, although depleted, continued to resist with guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and fortified defensive positions. Cities such as Pyongyang fell to UN forces, signaling the apparent collapse of North Korean resistance. Civilians, who had endured months of occupation and now faced the upheaval of ongoing military campaigns, fled en masse, creating humanitarian crises in newly liberated areas. Despite these challenges, MacArthur and UN command were confident that the war could be quickly concluded. Public statements and military reports suggested optimism that Korea could be fully unified under a pro-Western government. However, this confidence underestimated a looming strategic threat: China. The presence of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, prepared to intervene if UN forces approached the Yalu River, was largely dismissed in American planning. This miscalculation would soon have dramatic and far-reaching consequences. As UN forces pushed closer to the Chinese border, Beijing viewed the advance as a direct threat to national security. Mao Zedong, wary of Western intentions and deeply committed to supporting the communist North Korean regime, authorized the entry of Chinese forces into the conflict in late October 1950. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army, composed of hundreds of thousands of troops, crossed the Yalu River under the cover of darkness and harsh winter conditions, bringing the war to a new and deadly phase. The Chinese intervention was highly strategic. Troops utilized stealth, surprise, and knowledge of the terrain to engage UN forces in hit-and-run attacks, ambushes, and night assaults. The Chinese army, despite being less technologically equipped than the Americans, leveraged overwhelming manpower, coordination, and determination to halt the UN advance. These tactics proved devastating, particularly against extended UN supply lines and units unfamiliar with mountainous terrain and extreme winter conditions. For many UN soldiers, the sudden appearance of Chinese troops came as a shock, dramatically altering the dynamics of the battlefield. The entry of China transformed the war from a UN-North Korean confrontation into a major international conflict, escalating the stakes for the United States and its allies. It exposed the vulnerabilities of overextended forces and highlighted the limits of technological superiority against sheer numbers, strategy, and terrain advantage. The Chinese intervention marked the beginning of a prolonged struggle that would shift momentum away from UN forces and plunge the peninsula into further devastation. One of the most significant and brutal engagements following Chinese intervention was the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir in late November 1950. UN forces, primarily composed of US Marines and Army units, found themselves surrounded by tens of thousands of Chinese troops in freezing winter conditions. Temperatures plunged to -30°C, -22°F, compounding the difficulties of combat with frostbite, supply shortages, and exhaustion. The Chinese employed encirclement tactics, cutting off UN units from reinforcements and supply lines, forcing soldiers into desperate defensive positions. Despite being vastly outnumbered and facing near impossible odds, UN troops executed a strategic withdrawal in extraordinary conditions. This retreat, often described as one of the most heroic in modern military history, involved fighting through encirclements, maintaining unit cohesion, and evacuating the wounded under constant enemy fire. The logistical challenges were immense. Artillery, vehicles, and supplies had to be abandoned or destroyed, and extreme cold claimed as many soldiers as enemy action. Yet the determination, discipline, and leadership displayed during the battle allowed many UN units to escape annihilation. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir illustrated the harsh realities of the Korean War. Extreme weather, relentless enemy action, and the fine line between victory and disaster. It also marked the first major strategic setback for UN forces in North Korea, demonstrating that Chinese involvement would fundamentally change the trajectory of the conflict. The optimism that had followed Inchon and Seoul was replaced by the recognition that Korea would be a long, grueling war, with massive casualties, shifting front lines, and no immediate resolution in sight. By the winter of 1950, the United Nations forces, which had previously advanced deep into North Korea, were forced into a grueling retreat due to massive Chinese intervention. The initial optimism that had followed the Inchon Landing and the recapture of Seoul was replaced by panic and chaos as Chinese troops, often traveling by night and using guerrilla tactics, engaged UN forces along multiple fronts. UN units, spread thin across the peninsula, faced ambushes, artillery bombardments, and severe cold, which compounded the physical and psychological toll on soldiers. The retreat involved a strategic withdrawal over hundreds of miles in mountainous terrain, often under continuous enemy pressure. Soldiers endured sub-zero temperatures, inadequate winter clothing, and shortages of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Frostbite, exhaustion, and disease were as dangerous as enemy fire. Civilians, too, were caught in the turmoil, fleeing southward in massive numbers. Roads became congested with military convoys and refugee columns, slowing movements and creating opportunities for Chinese ambushes. Commanders at every level faced difficult decisions, balancing the need to hold positions with the imperative to save lives. Despite the overwhelming challenges, the UN forces executed orderly retreats, maintaining unit cohesion and inflicting casualties on pursuing Chinese forces whenever possible. The retreat revealed weaknesses in planning and intelligence, but also demonstrated remarkable resilience, leadership, and coordination. For the first time in the war, UN forces confronted the reality that North Korea and its Chinese allies were capable of sustained, highly effective military operations. The retreat also marked a pivotal turning point. The war was no longer a swift campaign aimed at unifying Korea, but had become a protracted, high-intensity conflict with uncertain outcomes. After months of retreat and hard-fought battles, UN and South Korean forces established a stabilized front line roughly near the 38th parallel by early 1951. This defensive line, supported by extensive fortifications, artillery emplacements, and minefields, allowed UN forces to consolidate, rest, and plan counteroffensives. The harsh winter had taken a toll on both sides, and Chinese and North Korean forces were also experiencing fatigue, logistical strain, and mounting casualties. The front, which would later stretch hundreds of miles from east to west, became a complex network of trenches, bunkers, and observation posts reminiscent of World War I-style warfare. During this period, the war transformed into a stalemate. Neither side could achieve a decisive breakthrough, as both were exhausted, and reinforcements were required to continue large-scale offensives. The UN forces focused on rebuilding infrastructure, improving supply lines, and integrating multinational contingents, while the Chinese and North Koreans fortified positions and prepared for future offensives. Intelligence became critical. Reconnaissance flights, intercepts, and espionage informed strategic decisions on both sides. Psychological warfare, propaganda, and political maneuvering were also employed to weaken enemy morale and maintain civilian support. The stabilization of the front allowed both sides to recover and reassess, but it also set the stage for a prolonged, attritional conflict. The war was no longer about rapid advances or decisive victories. It had evolved into a bloody stalemate, characterized by small-scale offensives, artillery duels, and fierce battles over strategically important hills, ridges, and towns. This shift fundamentally changed the nature of the conflict and foreshadowed the years of grueling trench warfare and negotiation stalemates that would follow. By 1951, the human toll of the Korean War was staggering. Millions of civilians had been displaced, tens of thousands were killed, and entire towns and villages had been destroyed by artillery, airstrikes, and ground combat. Refugee crises overwhelmed UN and South Korean relief efforts, with food, water, shelter, and medical care in short supply. Civilians were frequently caught between front lines, forced to navigate shifting territories, sometimes facing suspicion or persecution from both sides depending on perceived allegiances. For soldiers, the conditions were equally brutal. Frostbite, malnutrition, disease, and psychological stress were rampant. Letters from the front describe soldiers enduring long marches in sub-zero temperatures, improvising shelters, and coping with limited rations while maintaining vigilance against enemy attacks. Morale fluctuated with the tides of battle, with soldiers often facing the grim reality that gains were temporary and losses inevitable. Despite these hardships, camaraderie, discipline, and resilience allowed UN and South Korean troops to endure and continue fighting under extreme conditions. The war also reshaped Korean society and culture. Families were torn apart, traditional social structures disrupted, and entire regions depopulated. Refugees fled to urban centers, straining resources and creating new social dynamics. The conflict left deep psychological scars that would influence Korean politics, identity, and relations for generations. The stabilization of the front marked the beginning of a long attritional phase, where the physical and psychological cost of war became as significant as territorial gains or military strategy, underscoring the immense suffering endured by both soldiers and civilians during the Korean War. As 1951 progressed, the Korean War had settled into a deadly stalemate along the 38th parallel, with both sides entrenched in fortified positions across hilly terrain. One of the earliest and most significant battles during this phase was the Battle of Bloody Ridge, fought between August and September 1951. This engagement was centered on a series of ridges and hills south of the Inchon River, a strategic position controlling movement and observation in the region. The rugged terrain made offensive operations extremely difficult, and both sides suffered heavy casualties while attempting to gain control. UN forces, primarily composed of South Korean and U.S. infantry units, launched repeated assaults against North Korean positions. The North Korean army, having learned from earlier encounters, employed well-entrenched bunkers, minefields, and coordinated artillery fire to inflict maximum damage. Every ridge, hill, and forested area became a battlefield, with intense close-quarter combat defining the fighting. Despite repeated attempts, UN forces initially struggled to gain ground, and progress was measured in mere yards rather than miles. The battle quickly earned its name due to the staggering number of casualties, demonstrating the high human cost of even minor territorial gains in the stalemate phase. The Battle of Bloody Ridge also highlighted the evolving tactics of both sides. UN forces increasingly relied on combined arms operations, coordinating infantry assaults with artillery, air support, and armored units to overcome entrenched positions. Meanwhile, North Korean and Chinese troops perfected the art of defensive depth, using terrain, camouflage, and surprise attacks to slow advances and maximize attrition. This period of the war was marked less by sweeping maneuvers and more by grueling, methodical combat where every hill, ridge, and bunker carried immense strategic importance and came at a heavy human cost. Following Bloody Ridge, the fighting shifted to another key area known as Heartbreak Ridge, which became one of the defining engagements of the stalemate period. This series of battles, lasting from September to October 1951, involved repeated offensives against heavily fortified North Korean positions along a steep, rocky ridgeline. Heartbreak Ridge was emblematic of the attritional nature of the war at this stage. Soldiers faced relentless artillery bombardments, entrenched machine gun positions, and fierce hand-to-hand combat as they attempted to secure even minimal advances. The battle demonstrated the strategic challenges of mountainous terrain. UN forces had to advance uphill against well-prepared defensive positions, with limited cover and exposed supply lines. Coordination between artillery, airstrikes, and infantry was critical, but even with superior firepower, every meter of ground was contested fiercely. Casualties mounted on both sides, with repeated assaults often negating earlier gains. Soldiers described the experience as physically and mentally exhausting, with constant danger from sniper fire, booby traps, and sudden counterattacks. Heartbreak Ridge exemplified the war of attrition that defined much of the Korean conflict after the front stabilized. Unlike the rapid maneuvers of 1950, these engagements relied on careful planning, repeated assaults, and sustained pressure over weeks or months. Both sides adapted to prolonged combat. UN forces improved logistics, medical support, and artillery coordination, while North Korean and Chinese units refined defensive tactics and night operations. The battle underscored a grim reality. Even when territory changed hands, the human cost was enormous, and victory was measured less by land gained than by the ability to hold positions under relentless assault. The stalemate period forced a dramatic evolution in military tactics and soldier experience. With the front lines largely static, traditional large-scale maneuvers were replaced by localized offensives, artillery duels, and raids on enemy positions. Both sides emphasized intelligence gathering, reconnaissance, and psychological warfare to gain even minor advantages. Observation posts on hills, long-range artillery, and aerial reconnaissance became essential components of modern combat in Korea's rugged terrain. Soldiers endured continuous exposure to harsh weather, rugged terrain, and the stress of constant engagement. Winter and monsoon seasons compounded the difficulties, affecting movement, weapon functionality, and morale. Letters, diaries, and personal accounts from soldiers described the fatigue, fear, and camaraderie that defined daily life. Trench networks, bunkers, and field fortifications became homes, workplaces, and defensive lines, blurring the line between combat operations and survival. Morale fluctuated with small victories or devastating losses, yet the human capacity for endurance, solidarity, and courage was consistently evident. The tactical lessons learned during this period had long-term implications. Combined arms coordination, the importance of terrain, and attritional strategies informed military doctrine for decades. At the same time, the human cost of prolonged static combat highlighted the limitations of conventional approaches against determined, well-prepared defenses. Heartbreak Ridge, Bloody Ridge, and similar engagements became defining examples of the grueling, relentless nature of the Korean War, emphasizing that even in stalemate, the stakes were extraordinarily high, and the consequences for both soldiers and civilians were profound and lasting. By spring 1952, the Korean War had settled into a grueling stalemate along the front lines near the 38th parallel, but both sides continued to launch localized offensives in hopes of gaining strategic advantage. UN forces, composed of US, South Korean, and Allied units, initiated a series of carefully planned attacks on fortified positions held by North Korean and Chinese forces. These offensives, while limited in geographic scope, were meticulously coordinated to combine infantry, artillery, and air support. The goal was not necessarily to achieve sweeping territorial gains, but to inflict maximum attrition on the enemy and test defensive weaknesses. The spring offensives were characterized by intense and repeated combat over rugged terrain, including hills, ridges, and river crossings. North Korean and Chinese defenders, having learned from previous battles such as Heartbreak Ridge and Bloody Ridge, employed elaborate trench systems, underground bunkers, and extensive minefields, making advances slow, costly, and brutal. Infantry units were often forced to fight for mere meters of ground, with close-quarter combat, grenades, and bayonets frequently determining outcomes. Both sides incurred heavy casualties, reflecting the deadly nature of attritional warfare. Despite these challenges, the spring offensives demonstrated improvements in UN coordination and tactics. Artillery barrages were timed precisely to suppress enemy positions before infantry advances. Air reconnaissance allowed commanders to identify weak points and anticipate counterattacks. The offensives also showcased the importance of morale, training, and logistical support, as successful operations relied not only on strategy but on the resilience and discipline of soldiers enduring extreme physical and psychological stress. While the front lines did not shift dramatically, these offensives reinforced that both sides remained determined to fight, setting the stage for intensified air and naval operations. While the ground war was characterized by stalemate, the Korean War at sea played a crucial strategic role, particularly in controlling supply lines, projecting power, and supporting ground operations. UN naval forces, dominated by the United States, were tasked with enforcing blockades, providing amphibious support, and conducting coastal bombardments against North Korean positions. The Korean Peninsula's extensive coastline made naval operations critical, allowing UN forces to threaten enemy supply routes and assist in troop movements. One of the defining aspects of naval engagement was the amphibious assault capability, exemplified by earlier successes like Inchon. Amphibious ships delivered troops, vehicles, and supplies directly to contested areas, bypassing heavily defended positions and enabling rapid deployment. Coastal bombardments by naval artillery disrupted North Korean supply chains, destroyed infrastructure, and softened enemy positions ahead of infantry assaults. Naval aviation further expanded these capabilities, as carrier-based aircraft conducted reconnaissance, airstrikes, and interdiction missions with remarkable effectiveness. The presence of UN naval forces also provided psychological and strategic leverage. The North Korean military, lacking comparable naval power, was forced to defend vulnerable coastal regions and divert resources from the front lines. Sea control allowed UN forces to maintain supply lines even under extreme winter conditions, which was crucial given the difficult terrain and harsh weather affecting overland transportation. The naval dimension of the war, often overlooked, underscored the interconnected nature of modern warfare, where sea, air, and land operations were increasingly integrated to achieve operational objectives, further shaping the course of the Korean conflict. The air war in Korea represented a critical evolution in military technology and strategy. UN forces, particularly the United States Air Force, leveraged air superiority to conduct reconnaissance, close air support, strategic bombing, and interdiction missions. Jet fighters such as the F-86 Sabre engaged in aerial combat with Soviet-designed MiG-15s flown by North Korean, Chinese, and Soviet pilots, marking one of the first large-scale jet-versus-jet conflicts in history. These engagements highlighted the increasing importance of speed, maneuverability, and pilot skill in modern warfare. Air power was not only a tool of combat but also of psychological influence. Strategic bombing campaigns targeted infrastructure, supply lines, and troop concentrations, aiming to weaken the enemy's operational capacity and morale. Aerial reconnaissance provided commanders with real-time intelligence, enabling more precise artillery strikes and informed tactical decisions. Helicopters, though still in their infancy, began to be used for medical evacuation and supply transport, demonstrating early innovation in battlefield mobility and casualty management. Technological advantages extended beyond aircraft. UN forces utilized radar, improved communication systems, and coordinated artillery fire with unprecedented precision. This integration of technology, combined with training and logistics, provided UN forces with a decisive edge in mobility, situational awareness, and firepower. However, despite these technological advantages, the human cost remained immense. Ground soldiers continued to endure harsh conditions, brutal combat, and high casualties, illustrating that even in an era of advanced technology, warfare remained fundamentally grueling, dangerous, and unforgiving. By mid-1951, after more than a year and a half of brutal fighting, it became increasingly clear that neither side could achieve a decisive victory. The war had devolved into a grueling stalemate, with entrenched positions and repeated small-scale offensives along the front lines. Recognizing the tremendous human and material cost, international pressure mounted for a negotiated settlement. In July 1951, preliminary armistice talks began at Kaesong, later moving to Panmunjom, signaling the start of what would become a protracted diplomatic struggle. The talks were complex and often frustrating, reflecting the competing priorities of the belligerents and their respective allies. The United Nations Command, led primarily by the United States, sought a ceasefire while maintaining South Korea's sovereignty and security. North Korea, backed by China, insisted on conditions that would protect the North's interests and preserve the status quo. Negotiators faced challenges including prisoner of war, POW, repatriation, territorial lines, and the supervision of demilitarized zones. Discussions were often stalled by disagreements, propaganda campaigns, and ongoing military operations intended to strengthen negotiating positions. The initial rounds of negotiation highlighted both the possibilities and limitations of diplomacy during wartime. While the talks offered hope of ending the bloodshed, they also exposed deep ideological divides. Both sides used the negotiations not only as a means of seeking peace, but also as a tool to influence global public opinion and solidify internal political legitimacy. The early stages of talks underscored a critical reality. The Korean War was no longer solely a military conflict. It had evolved into a complex political struggle involving multiple nations, ideologies, and global stakes. One of the most contentious issues during the peace talks was the treatment and repatriation of prisoners of war, POWs. Both sides had captured tens of thousands of enemy combatants, and each demanded conditions favorable to their political and military objectives. The United Nations insisted on voluntary repatriation, allowing POWs to decide whether to return to their home country or remain with the captors. China and North Korea, however, sought compulsory repatriation, viewing any refusal as a threat to political authority and ideological control. These disagreements led to months of deadlock, with negotiations frequently breaking down over POW issues. Meanwhile, skirmishes, artillery duels, and raids continued unabated along the front lines, demonstrating that diplomacy and combat were occurring simultaneously. Soldiers, officers, and civilians remained under constant threat, and each side used ongoing military pressure as leverage to influence the outcome of negotiations. Propaganda campaigns sought to sway public opinion both domestically and internationally, portraying the opposing side as unreasonable or untrustworthy. Despite the stalemate, the POW dispute eventually became a framework for compromise. Neutral nations, including Sweden and Switzerland, were brought in to oversee repatriation and monitor conditions. This phase highlighted the intersection of military, humanitarian, and diplomatic challenges in modern warfare. The Korean War, often described as the Forgotten War, gained renewed attention as the POW issue emphasized the human dimension of conflict, illustrating that negotiations were not only about territory but also about lives, ideology, and long-term reconciliation. While peace talks proceeded, the front lines remained deadly and dynamic. Both sides sought to improve their positions, conduct reconnaissance, and probe enemy defenses, often using raids and limited offensives to gain tactical advantage. Artillery exchanges became routine, with both sides employing increasingly sophisticated targeting techniques and integrating air support to maximize impact. The terrain of Korea, steep hills, rivers, and dense forests, continued to shape combat, creating opportunities for ambushes, infiltration, and defensive depth. For soldiers on the ground, this period was marked by grueling endurance. Units often faced harsh weather conditions, scarce supplies, and constant threat of attack, while participating in operations intended to strengthen negotiating positions rather than achieve decisive battlefield victories. The psychological toll was immense, as men endured prolonged exposure to danger without clear progress or resolution. Civilians continued to suffer from displacement, infrastructure destruction, and shortages of basic necessities, reflecting the war's ongoing humanitarian impact. Despite the ongoing hostilities, the protracted negotiations laid the groundwork for eventual resolution. Both sides realized that military victories alone could not end the conflict, making compromise inevitable. The combination of diplomatic persistence and battlefield pressure set the stage for the eventual armistice, demonstrating the intricate interplay between combat, politics, and international diplomacy. By the end of this phase, the war had become a profound lesson in the limits of military force, the complexities of negotiation, and the enduring consequences of ideological conflict on human lives. By 1952, the Korean War had settled into a protracted, grinding stalemate. Both UN and communist forces were entrenched along fortified lines near the 38th parallel, with control of key hills, ridges, and outposts determining strategic advantage. Among the most brutal and symbolic engagements were the so-called hill battles, where soldiers fought over elevations that were tactically significant but costly to hold. Hills such as Triangle Hill, Old Baldy, and White Horse became focal points for repeated offensives, with each side committing thousands of troops to seize and defend positions over weeks or even months. The fighting during these hill battles was relentless and exhausting. Infantry assaults were met with entrenched machine gun nests, artillery fire, and well-planned counterattacks. Engineers laid minefields and barbed wire, while forward observers directed artillery and airstrikes to repel advances. Each gain came at immense cost. Soldiers endured intense physical exertion, constant exposure to enemy fire, and extreme psychological stress. Casualty rates were staggering, yet both sides recognized the symbolic importance of controlling terrain, as it demonstrated resolve, boosted morale, and provided observation advantages over the enemy. These hill battles exemplified the attritional nature of the final year of combat. Territory changed hands frequently, but neither side could achieve a decisive breakthrough. Commanders adapted tactics to minimize losses, incorporating artillery barrages, coordinated airstrikes, and infiltration teams. Despite technological advantages for UN forces, including superior artillery, aircraft, and communications, the determination and resilience of Chinese and North Korean troops ensured that gains were temporary. By 1952, the war had become a costly test of endurance, strategy, and human willpower, setting the stage for negotiations while the fighting continued relentlessly. The air war intensified in the final year, with both sides seeking to leverage technology to influence the battlefield and the ongoing armistice negotiations. The United States Air Force deployed jet fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft to control the skies, conduct interdiction operations, and strike key logistical targets. Aircraft such as the F-86 Sabre dominated dogfights against MiG-15 jets, with pilots engaging in high-speed aerial combat over the rugged Korean terrain. These engagements represented some of the earliest large-scale jet versus jet battles in military history, highlighting the importance of pilot skill, radar guidance, and tactical coordination. Strategic bombing campaigns targeted infrastructure, bridges, railways, and supply depots to disrupt communist logistics. Air power was not only a tool of destruction but also of psychological pressure, demonstrating UN technological superiority and influencing both enemy morale and international perception. The presence of aerial reconnaissance provided commanders with critical intelligence for artillery targeting and ground operations, allowing for more precise, coordinated offensives. Helicopters, though still emerging as military assets, were increasingly used for medical evacuation and rapid troop deployment, providing logistical flexibility in difficult terrain. Despite the technological edge, the human toll remained staggering. Pilots and aircrew faced risks of anti-aircraft fire, adverse weather, and mechanical failures. Ground troops contended with relentless artillery and airstrikes that could devastate positions in minutes. The interplay of technology, terrain, and human endurance defined the final year of major operations. Despite superior firepower and advanced equipment, the war's outcome remained uncertain, emphasizing that modern technology could shape, but not fully determine, the course of conflict. As 1952 progressed, both sides increasingly recognized the limits of further military action. Hill battles, artillery duels, and aerial campaigns had inflicted enormous casualties, devastated infrastructure, and exhausted soldiers. The front lines were largely static, and continued offensives yielded diminishing returns. This strategic reality set the stage for intensified preparatory moves for armistice negotiations, as each side sought to strengthen positions and influence terms before formal agreements could be reached. UN forces reinforced defensive positions along key ridges and hills, ensuring that territory held during negotiations would be protected. Logistical improvements focused on maintaining troop readiness, resupplying forward positions, and integrating multinational forces to maximize combat effectiveness. Meanwhile, North Korean and Chinese troops fortified positions, stockpiled supplies, and improved coordination between infantry, artillery, and air defense. Intelligence gathering, including reconnaissance and interception, became critical in anticipating enemy maneuvers and minimizing vulnerability. Politically, the continued stalemate and heavy losses created pressure for a negotiated solution. The United States, South Korea, China, and North Korea engaged in parallel diplomatic efforts, with military operations often timed to strengthen bargaining positions. The final year of major combat reflected the dual nature of the war: intense battlefield activity designed to gain tactical advantage, paired with a growing realization that military victory alone could not end the conflict. By late 1952, both sides were preparing for a transition from active combat toward negotiations that would eventually culminate in the 1953 armistice, illustrating the complex interplay of strategy, diplomacy, and endurance in one of the 20th century's most challenging wars. By early 1953, the Korean War had entered its final phase, with both sides engaged in limited offensives and defensive operations to strengthen their positions before a potential ceasefire. Despite ongoing negotiations at Panmunjom, fighting continued with intensity along strategic hills, ridges, and outposts. Units clashed repeatedly over locations that, while small in geographic scale, carried immense symbolic and tactical significance. The battles were characterized by entrenched positions, intense artillery exchanges, and small unit actions that tested the endurance, morale, and resourcefulness of soldiers on both sides. The last major offensives aimed to gain leverage in ongoing armistice negotiations. UN forces launched coordinated attacks on hill positions, artillery batteries, and fortified bunkers, seeking to secure advantageous terrain that could influence post-war boundaries and defensive lines. These operations often involved complex integration of infantry, armor, and air support, as commanders relied on combined arms tactics to overcome well-prepared defenses. North Korean and Chinese units responded with counterattacks, ambushes, and infiltration operations, demonstrating both resilience and tactical adaptability. While gains and losses were measured in meters rather than miles, the human cost remained immense. Soldiers endured extreme weather conditions, exhaustion, and the constant threat of artillery, snipers, and booby traps. Casualty rates remained high, and medical services struggled to care for the wounded in forward positions. These final engagements underscored the grim reality that even as a diplomatic resolution approached, the war's brutality persisted, exacting a heavy toll on both combatants and civilians in contested regions. Amid the ongoing combat, armistice negotiations at Panmunjom became increasingly central to the war's resolution. These talks, beginning in 1951 and continuing intermittently until 1953, were marked by complex diplomatic maneuvering, ideological differences, and strategic posturing. The key issues included the demarcation line, repatriation of prisoners of war, and the establishment of a demilitarized zone, DMZ. Each side leveraged battlefield gains to strengthen its negotiating position, demonstrating the interconnection between diplomacy and military operations. The negotiations were slow and often contentious. The United Nations insisted on voluntary repatriation of POWs, allowing captured soldiers to decide whether to return to their home countries or remain with their captors. China and North Korea demanded compulsory repatriation, viewing POWs as essential to political control and ideological integrity. Discussions were further complicated by external pressures, including global Cold War dynamics, domestic political considerations, and media coverage that influenced public perception of the conflict. Despite these challenges, incremental progress was made. Neutral nations, such as Sweden and Switzerland, were called upon to mediate and oversee POW exchanges, providing a framework for compromise. The Panmunjom talks highlighted the limitations of military force in achieving political objectives. While combat operations continued to inflict casualties and shape tactical realities, a negotiated settlement required diplomacy, patience, and coordination among multiple parties. By mid-1953, the negotiations were approaching a conclusion, setting the stage for a formal armistice that would halt large-scale hostilities on the Korean peninsula. By the time the armistice was imminent in July 1953, the Korean War had exacted a staggering toll on both military forces and civilian populations. Estimates suggest that millions of civilians were killed, wounded, or displaced, with entire towns and villages destroyed by artillery bombardment, airstrikes, and ground combat. Refugee populations overwhelmed cities and relief networks, creating humanitarian crises characterized by shortages of food, medical care, and shelter. Civilians were often caught in the crossfire, and allegiances could determine treatment or survival under occupation by different forces. For military personnel, the war had been equally devastating. Soldiers on both sides endured extreme conditions, including bitter winters, rugged terrain, disease, and psychological stress. Casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands for UN, North Korean, and Chinese forces. The human cost was compounded by repeated engagements over small terrain features, relentless artillery duels, and high-intensity combat that left both sides exhausted and demoralized. Despite technological superiority, air support, and artillery coordination, the war remained fundamentally brutal and unforgiving, reflecting the limits of modern warfare in mountainous, heavily fortified regions. The cumulative impact of years of fighting reshaped Korean society, politics, and geography. Cities and infrastructure were decimated, traditional communities disrupted, and the peninsula left divided both physically and ideologically. While soldiers returned home and civilians attempted to rebuild, the scars of the war remained visible, setting the stage for decades of tension and the enduring division of Korea. The final phase of combat underscored that even as peace approached, the legacy of the Korean War would continue to influence generations, illustrating the profound and lasting consequences of a conflict often called the Forgotten War. On July 27, 1953, the Korean War officially reached a halt with the signing of the Korean Armistice Agreement at Panmunjom. After more than 3 years of intense and costly conflict, the armistice ended active hostilities but did not constitute a formal peace treaty, leaving the Korean peninsula technically at war. The agreement was signed by representatives of the United Nations Command, led by the United States, North Korea, and China, while South Korea, led by President Syngman Rhee, refused to sign, opposing the terms of the ceasefire and the lack of guarantees for reunification. The armistice established a militarized demarcation line, commonly referred to as the 38th parallel, with a buffer zone known as the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, extending approximately 2 kilometers on either side. The DMZ was heavily fortified, monitored by both sides, and included observation posts, minefields, and restricted access areas, making it one of the most militarized borders in the world. In addition, the armistice included provisions for prisoner of war exchanges, monitored by neutral nations, and mechanisms for maintaining the ceasefire, such as the Military Armistice Commission, which ensured communication and conflict resolution between opposing forces. While the armistice did not resolve underlying political or ideological conflicts, it effectively ended large-scale combat. For soldiers, it meant a reprieve from daily life on the front lines, though the DMZ remained a tense and dangerous region. Civilians, especially those living near the new border, faced long-term displacement and restrictions. The signing highlighted the complex interplay of diplomacy, military pressure, and international negotiation, demonstrating that even after years of devastating conflict, compromise, though imperfect, was necessary to prevent further loss of life and establish a framework for stability. The Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, became the most visible symbol of the Korean War's unresolved legacy. Stretching roughly 250 kilometers across the peninsula, the DMZ was intended to serve as a neutral buffer between North and South Korea, preventing accidental or deliberate military engagement. Both sides fortified their positions along the zone, creating trenches, bunkers, and observation posts, while deploying artillery and troops nearby to maintain strategic control. Despite its name, the DMZ became one of the most heavily armed and monitored borders in the world, with extensive landmines, barbed wire, and surveillance infrastructure. The DMZ had significant military, political, and symbolic implications. Militarily, it allowed both sides to maintain defensive positions without immediate risk of full-scale engagement, while still projecting strength and readiness. Politically, the DMZ represented the division of the Korean peninsula into 2 separate states, solidifying the ideological split between communist North Korea and pro-Western South Korea. Symbolically, it became a global representation of Cold War tension, exemplifying the consequences of proxy wars and the division of nations along ideological lines. The creation of the DMZ also had human and ecological consequences. Civilians living in or near the zone faced displacement, restricted access, and constant uncertainty. Over time, however, the lack of human habitation allowed a unique ecological zone to develop, with wildlife thriving in areas untouched by human activity. The DMZ's dual nature, as a heavily militarized border and an accidental wildlife preserve, illustrates the enduring and complex legacy of the Korean War, bridging military strategy, international diplomacy, and environmental transformation. The armistice and establishment of the DMZ reshaped the geopolitical landscape of East Asia. The Korean peninsula remained divided into two nations with opposing ideologies, setting the stage for decades of tension and periodic military confrontations. The United States solidified its military presence in South Korea, establishing permanent bases and defense agreements to deter North Korean aggression. North Korea, with Chinese and Soviet support, consolidated control over the North, pursuing industrialization, military buildup, and political centralization under the Kim Il-sung regime. Globally, the Korean War influenced Cold War dynamics. The conflict demonstrated the willingness of the United States to intervene militarily to contain communism, reinforcing the policy of containment in Asia. China emerged as a major military power capable of influencing regional conflicts, gaining international recognition for its ability to project force and counter a technologically superior adversary. The war also shaped military doctrine, emphasizing the importance of combined arms operations, air superiority, and logistical coordination, lessons that influenced later conflicts such as Vietnam. On a societal level, the war left deep scars. Millions of civilians had been killed or displaced, and the destruction of infrastructure hindered economic recovery. Families were separated across the DMZ, creating long-lasting social and emotional consequences. Politically, the division of Korea hardened national identities and fostered ideologically driven governance systems, with South Korea eventually transitioning to democracy decades later, while North Korea developed a rigid, authoritarian state. The post-war period illustrated that while the armistice ended active fighting, the war's consequences would shape the Korean peninsula and global geopolitics for generations, embedding the conflict deeply into the Cold War narrative and international relations. After the armistice in 1953, South Korea faced the monumental task of rebuilding a society devastated by 3 years of war. Cities such as Seoul had been almost completely destroyed by artillery, aerial bombardments, and street-to-street fighting. Infrastructure, including roads, bridges, hospitals, and schools, had been shattered, making basic services scarce. The civilian population, which had endured displacement, famine, and loss of family members, faced immense challenges in resuming everyday life. Refugees who had fled from the north struggled to find homes and employment, placing enormous pressure on local communities and government resources. The social fabric of South Korea had been deeply affected. Families were separated by the newly established demilitarized zone, with many unable to contact relatives in the north. Psychological trauma was widespread as people coped with the memories of violence, loss, and deprivation. Social hierarchies and traditional community structures were disrupted, creating instability and forcing a reorganization of society. Education systems had to be rebuilt from scratch, while new policies aimed at national unity and security were implemented. Despite these hardships, South Koreans began the process of recovery, driven by resilience, a sense of national identity, and the urgent need to rebuild a functioning society amid poverty and devastation. The war's impact extended beyond physical and social structures. Political tensions remained high as South Korea, under President Syngman Rhee, implemented strict measures to suppress communist sympathizers and consolidate control. The fear of renewed conflict and the threat of North Korean incursions influenced everyday life, with military service, civil defense drills, and propaganda becoming central to the national experience. The post-war period was marked by a combination of determination, vulnerability, and societal transformation, as South Korea sought to recover from the immediate consequences of the war while preparing for a future still threatened by ideological conflict. The economic impact of the Korean War on South Korea was catastrophic. Industrial facilities, factories, and farmland had been destroyed or severely damaged, halting production and contributing to widespread unemployment. The nation faced shortages of food, fuel, and raw materials, leading to famine-like conditions in certain areas. Trade and transportation networks were disrupted, and rebuilding basic infrastructure became a top priority. Urban centers, heavily damaged during the conflict, had to be reconstructed, while rural areas required reorganization to restore agricultural productivity. International aid, primarily from the United States, played a critical role in the early stages of economic recovery. Food assistance, medical supplies, and reconstruction aid provided the essential resources for survival and rebuilding. The government implemented policies aimed at stabilizing the economy, fostering industrial growth, and integrating returning refugees into the workforce. Despite these efforts, recovery was slow, with living standards remaining low for many years. South Korea faced the dual challenge of addressing the immediate humanitarian crisis while laying the groundwork for sustainable development, a process that would take decades to fully achieve. The war also catalyzed long-term economic transformation. Reconstruction efforts led to modernization in infrastructure and the establishment of new industries. Labor movements, urbanization, and investment in education began reshaping society. While the immediate post-war years were characterized by hardship and scarcity, the foundations for South Korea's eventual economic miracle were laid during this period, as resilience, international support, and strategic planning set the stage for future growth. In North Korea, the social and economic consequences were equally severe, though shaped by a different political and ideological framework. The war had devastated the northern industrial base, agricultural lands, and urban centers, including the capital, Pyongyang. Infrastructure had been heavily damaged, and millions of civilians faced displacement, food shortages, and the psychological impact of prolonged conflict. Unlike the South, North Korea's reconstruction was centrally planned and heavily influenced by communist ideology, with the government controlling allocation of resources, labor, and industrial priorities. The North Korean regime, led by Kim Il-sung, emphasized rapid reconstruction to consolidate political authority and demonstrate the state's ability to provide for the population. Policies included forced mobilization of labor for rebuilding efforts, collectivization of agriculture, and prioritization of heavy industry to rebuild the war-torn economy. Education and propaganda were used to foster loyalty to the regime and create a unified national identity centered on the leadership and the socialist vision. While these policies achieved significant rebuilding in certain sectors, they often came at the cost of individual freedom, widespread hardship, and limited consumer goods. The war's human cost in North Korea was profound. Civilian casualties were high, and families faced long-term separation due to the DMZ. Psychological trauma, displacement, and the collapse of traditional social structures created lasting social challenges. Yet, the post-war period also established the foundations for North Korea's authoritarian system, centralized economy, and militarized society. While both Koreas faced immense challenges after the armistice, the contrasting political and economic approaches shaped their post-war trajectories, with the South gradually moving toward market-driven development and democratic governance, and the North toward centralized control, ideological conformity, and military prioritization. The Korean War offered profound insights into modern military strategy and warfare, influencing doctrines worldwide. One of the most significant lessons was the importance of combined arms operations, integrating infantry, artillery, armor, and air power to achieve tactical objectives. The war highlighted the critical role of coordination between ground and air forces, as well as the necessity of logistics in sustaining prolonged engagements over challenging terrain. Battles such as Heartbreak Ridge, Bloody Ridge, and the Hill engagements of 1952 to 1953 demonstrated that even well-equipped forces could struggle without precise synchronization, preparation, and intelligence. Another key lesson involved the value of mobility and terrain mastery. Korea's mountainous landscape, harsh winters, and river networks posed enormous operational challenges. Units that effectively utilized reconnaissance, understanding of terrain, and tactical maneuvering gained significant advantages, while forces that underestimated these factors suffered catastrophic losses. The war underscored that technology alone, air power, tanks, or artillery, could not replace strategic planning, flexibility, and the ability to adapt to environmental and logistical constraints. Additionally, the Korean War demonstrated the growing importance of sustainability and troop morale. Prolonged engagements, static defensive lines, and high casualty rates tested soldiers' endurance, discipline, and psychological resilience. Successful commanders emphasized rotation, rest, and support services to maintain operational effectiveness. This experience influenced future military training and operational planning, particularly in the context of asymmetric warfare, protracted conflicts, and Cold War-era confrontations where battles could no longer be resolved quickly or decisively. The Korean War had profound implications for the global balance of power and the broader Cold War. It confirmed the willingness of the United States and its allies to intervene militarily to contain communism, establishing a precedent for American engagement in regional conflicts far from its borders. The war reinforced the strategic importance of alliances such as NATO and SEATO, and strengthened U.S. commitments to Japan, Taiwan, and other Asia-Pacific partners as buffers against potential communist expansion. China's entry into the war demonstrated its ability to project power regionally and counter technologically superior adversaries, challenging Western assumptions about military dominance. The conflict also solidified China's role in Cold War geopolitics, enhancing its standing among communist nations while testing the limits of Soviet influence. For the Soviet Union, the war allowed indirect engagement against the United States through proxy forces without direct confrontation, reflecting the nature of Cold War-era proxy wars that would dominate global conflicts in the following decades. The Korean War highlighted the geopolitical consequences of regional conflicts, showing how local wars could escalate into global strategic concerns. It shaped U.S. military and foreign policy, reinforcing the policy of containment, encouraging arms buildup, and emphasizing the strategic use of alliances, bases, and military aid programs. The lessons learned in Korea informed American and global approaches to subsequent Cold War conflicts, including Vietnam, the Middle East, and other theaters where ideological confrontation and regional power struggles intersected with international security concerns. Beyond immediate strategic and geopolitical lessons, the Korean War had a lasting influence on military doctrine, technology, and planning for future conflicts. The war was one of the first major post-World War II conflicts, demonstrating the challenges of limited war under nuclear threat. While nuclear weapons were never used in Korea, their existence shaped strategy, limiting escalation and influencing both political and military decision-making. Commanders had to balance conventional operations with the awareness that escalation could trigger global consequences, a concept that would dominate Cold War military thinking. The conflict also advanced air power doctrine, especially in jet combat, close air support, and strategic bombing in contested airspace. Helicopters and other emerging technologies were used for logistics, medical evacuation, and reconnaissance, foreshadowing their expanded role in Vietnam and later conflicts. Infantry and combined arms tactics were refined, and the Korean War's attritional battles demonstrated the importance of fortifications, defensive depth, and the integration of technological assets with human operations. On a broader scale, the war influenced the training, mindset, and preparedness of global militaries. Armies around the world studied Korea as a case study in terrain, weather, logistics, and international coalition warfare. Lessons in coordination, attrition, morale, and political military integration informed doctrine for decades. The war illustrated that modern conflicts could not be understood purely in terms of territorial conquest. They involved ideology, diplomacy, technological superiority, and the human dimension of warfare, shaping the approach to conflicts throughout the latter half of the 20th century. The Korean War left profound social and cultural scars in South Korea that shaped the country for decades. Millions of civilians were killed, displaced, or separated from family members across the newly established Demilitarized Zone, DMZ. Entire towns and villages were destroyed, and the trauma of displacement and loss deeply influenced family structures and social networks. Families who had been split by the war often never reunited, creating a generational legacy of separation and grief that became a defining element of South Korean identity. The war also shaped cultural production, influencing literature, cinema, music, and visual arts. Writers and filmmakers grappled with themes of survival, loss, displacement, and national identity, reflecting both personal and collective experiences. Memoirs, diaries, and oral histories provided intimate insights into the horrors and resilience of war, preserving memory for future generations. These cultural expressions also played a political role, reinforcing narratives of anti-communism, national unity, and the moral justification for South Korea's post-war reconstruction efforts. Education and civic identity were also influenced heavily by the war. Curricula emphasized the lessons of the conflict, including the dangers of ideological division, the importance of democracy, and the value of national defense. Military service became a rite of passage, deeply embedded in the social fabric. The Korean War instilled a sense of vigilance and resilience in South Korean society, shaping collective memory, national identity, and cultural expression in ways that continue to resonate in modern Korea. In North Korea, the Korean War reinforced the regime's authoritarian and ideological framework. The human cost of the war, including massive casualties and displacement, was reframed by state propaganda as evidence of struggle, sacrifice, and heroism under the leadership of Kim Il-sung. Civilians were encouraged to view the conflict as a foundational moment for the nation, reinforcing loyalty to the state and the military-first ethos that would dominate North Korean society. The war also shaped education, culture, and social norms in North Korea. Schools, youth organizations, and media were structured to cultivate devotion to the leadership, military readiness, and collective solidarity. Monuments, memorials, and art celebrated wartime victories and heroism, embedding the conflict into the nation's historical narrative. Oral histories and cultural performances highlighted stories of resistance, struggle, and triumph, contributing to a national mythology centered on endurance, unity, and anti-imperialist ideology. Beyond culture, the war's social impact was evident in population movements, urban rebuilding, and industrial prioritization. Cities like Pyongyang were reconstructed as showcases of socialist achievement, blending recovery with political messaging. Families were reshaped through displacement, state-assigned housing, and labor mobilization. The Korean War thus became a defining event for North Korea, shaping identity, ideology, governance, and cultural memory in ways that continue to influence society, politics, and daily life. The Korean War's legacy extends far beyond the peninsula, influencing international relations and Cold War geopolitics. The division of Korea created a lasting flashpoint in East Asia, with the DMZ remaining one of the most militarized borders in the world. The United States maintains a significant military presence in South Korea, providing security guarantees, regional stability, and strategic deterrence against North Korean provocations. Conversely, North Korea's regime continues to leverage its military capabilities, including nuclear development, as central to its domestic legitimacy and international posture. Globally, the war shaped perceptions of U.S. foreign policy, communist expansion, and the dynamics of Cold War proxy conflicts. It demonstrated that regional wars could escalate into broader geopolitical crises, prompting nations to consider alliances, military readiness, and intervention policies carefully. The Korean War also served as a template for international coalition operations, including United Nations-led military efforts that integrated multiple national forces under unified command structures. In the 21st century, the Korean War remains highly relevant. Inter-Korean relations continue to be defined by the armistice, border tensions, and historical memory. Periodic military provocations, diplomatic negotiations, and summits reflect the unresolved nature of the conflict. The war's enduring impact underscores that historical events do not merely belong to the past. They shape contemporary politics, security strategies, and social consciousness. The Korean War's legacy persists as a cautionary tale, a source of identity, and a driver of diplomacy, illustrating the complex interplay of memory, history, and modern international relations. The Korean War marked one of the first large-scale military interventions led by the United Nations, establishing a precedent for international collective security. When North Korean forces invaded South Korea in June 1950, the UN Security Council quickly responded, condemning the attack and authorizing a UN-led military force to assist South Korea. This rapid intervention reflected the post-World War II commitment to prevent aggression and maintain global peace, but it also demonstrated the practical challenges of translating diplomatic resolutions into effective military action. The UN command was dominated by the United States, providing the majority of troops, logistical support, and strategic direction, but forces from countries including the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Turkey, France, and several others participated, forming a multinational coalition. This diversity brought both strengths and challenges. Varied military traditions, languages, and equipment had to be integrated into a unified command, requiring advanced coordination and communication. Despite these difficulties, the coalition demonstrated that international cooperation could achieve rapid mobilization in response to regional aggression, setting an important model for future UN peacekeeping and military operations. UN involvement also had symbolic importance. It reinforced the principle that aggression against a sovereign nation would not go unchecked, establishing norms for collective defense and international law. The intervention showcased the potential of international organizations to mediate, coordinate, and legitimize military action, even when acting in volatile geopolitical contexts. While primarily a military coalition, the UN presence also included humanitarian and medical efforts, reflecting the complex responsibilities of multinational intervention in a conflict that combined combat, civilian suffering, and ideological stakes. The UN-led intervention in Korea faced significant operational and political challenges. Forces were rapidly deployed into a country with rugged terrain, harsh winters, and underdeveloped infrastructure. Early UN successes, including the amphibious landing at Inchon, highlighted the potential of coordinated operations, but the counteroffensive that pushed forces toward the Yalu River exposed logistical vulnerabilities and strategic overreach. The entry of Chinese forces into the conflict further complicated operations, demonstrating the unpredictability of international warfare and the limits of coalition forces when faced with highly motivated adversaries. Despite these setbacks, the UN command achieved several lasting accomplishments. It prevented the complete conquest of South Korea, stabilized front lines along the 38th parallel, and maintained international legitimacy for military operations. The coalition also demonstrated the integration of air, land, and naval power, refined combined arms tactics, and improved coordination among multinational forces. Medical services, supply chains, and refugee assistance were organized on a scale unprecedented for UN operations, emphasizing the combination of combat readiness and humanitarian responsibility. Politically, the UN intervention solidified a precedent for international military cooperation under collective security frameworks, influencing future conflicts. The Korean War showed that the UN could mobilize diverse nations to defend sovereignty, even without the participation of some key member states. It also revealed the limits of such interventions, particularly in conflicts complicated by ideology, proxy involvement, and asymmetric warfare. Overall, the war offered a blueprint for balancing military necessity, political legitimacy, and humanitarian considerations in future multinational operations. The Korean War's UN involvement created a lasting precedent that would influence peacekeeping and international military operations for decades. It demonstrated that the United Nations could act decisively in response to aggression, mobilizing resources and coordinating multinational forces in a limited war setting. Unlike later peacekeeping missions, which often relied on unarmed observers or lightly armed troops, Korea required full-scale combat capabilities, highlighting the flexibility and potential of UN-sanctioned operations. The conflict also influenced global norms regarding intervention, sovereignty, and collective security. The rapid UN response reinforced the expectation that violations of territorial integrity could trigger coordinated international action. Lessons from Korea shaped subsequent peacekeeping doctrines, emphasizing command structure, logistics, intelligence sharing, and cultural coordination among diverse forces. The war illustrated the importance of clear objectives, unified command, and integration of military, diplomatic, and humanitarian goals, a framework that would guide future interventions in regions such as the Congo, Cyprus, and the Persian Gulf. Additionally, the Korean experience revealed both the strengths and limitations of UN operations. While the coalition successfully halted aggression and preserved South Korean sovereignty, the armistice demonstrated that military victory was not always synonymous with political resolution. This duality influenced international expectations of UN operations, highlighting the need for diplomacy, negotiation, and post-conflict stabilization alongside military action. The legacy of the UN in Korea remains a touchstone for understanding the evolving role of international organizations in conflict resolution, collective defense, and the management of global security in a complex and interconnected world. The Korean War resulted in massive human suffering, affecting millions of civilians across the peninsula. Estimates suggest that between 2 to 3 million civilians were killed during the conflict, with millions more wounded or displaced. Entire towns and villages were destroyed by relentless artillery barrages, aerial bombings, and urban combat, leaving survivors with few resources or safe shelter. Cities such as Seoul, Pyongyang, and Wonsan were heavily damaged, creating crises in housing, sanitation, and access to essential services. Beyond physical destruction, civilians faced severe shortages of food, medical care, and clean water. Agricultural lands were destroyed, livestock killed, and infrastructure for irrigation and transportation devastated. Malnutrition and disease became rampant, compounding the suffering of those already traumatized by the violence. Hospitals struggled to cope with the influx of casualties, and medical supplies were scarce, leading to high mortality rates among both wounded soldiers and civilians. Humanitarian organizations, including the Red Cross and international aid groups, attempted to provide relief, but logistical challenges, ongoing combat, and political restrictions often limited their effectiveness. Psychological trauma was widespread. Civilians who survived the fighting experienced grief, displacement, and the stress of constant danger. Families were separated, sometimes permanently, due to the creation of the DMZ and the chaotic conditions during the war. Children were orphaned or forced into labor to survive, while adults struggled to maintain livelihoods amid the destruction. The immediate humanitarian impact of the war left an indelible mark on the Korean people, shaping the post-war recovery efforts and national consciousness in both North and South Korea. The Korean War triggered one of the largest refugee crises in the 20th century. Millions of people fled their homes to escape fighting, occupation, or reprisals. In the south, civilians fled northward advances of the North Korean army, while in the north, families fled southward to escape bombings and Chinese or UN operations. The movement of populations was chaotic and dangerous, often exposing refugees to exposure, starvation, or attack. Temporary camps sprang up in cities, along railways, and in rural areas, but conditions were dire, with overcrowding, poor sanitation, and inadequate food supplies creating humanitarian emergencies. The refugee crisis had long-term social and economic consequences. Communities in South Korea absorbed large numbers of displaced persons, placing a tremendous strain on housing, employment, and social services. Refugees often faced discrimination, limited access to resources, and challenges integrating into existing communities. In North Korea, displaced populations were sometimes relocated by the state, forced into labor brigades, or resettled for political and ideological reasons. These demographic shifts permanently altered population distributions, urbanization patterns, and social dynamics, contributing to long-lasting societal change. International organizations played a crucial role in addressing the refugee crisis. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRRA, alongside other agencies, provided food, medical care, and logistical support to displaced populations. However, continued fighting, political divisions, and limited access often hampered relief efforts. The crisis highlighted the interconnectedness of war, displacement, and humanitarian response, underscoring the importance of coordinated international action in modern conflicts, a lesson that would influence responses to subsequent wars worldwide. The Korean War's demographic consequences extended well beyond immediate displacement. Both North and South Korea suffered massive population losses, estimated in the millions, which disrupted labor forces, family structures, and community cohesion. The separation of families across the DMZ created generational trauma, as children grew up without parents or siblings, and couples were permanently divided by the new political and geographical realities. Fertility rates, mortality rates, and population growth were all affected, slowing post-war recovery and creating long-lasting social challenges. Urban and rural population distributions were reshaped. Cities in South Korea had to absorb both returning populations and refugees, accelerating urbanization but also creating overcrowding and economic strain. In North Korea, reconstruction efforts were combined with ideological programs, including labor mobilization, collectivization, and population redistribution, altering social organization and control mechanisms. Communities in both regions were forced to adapt to new realities, with traditional social networks weakened or transformed by displacement and migration. The war's demographic impact also had political and strategic implications. Population losses, refugee flows, and resettlement patterns influenced post-war reconstruction priorities, resource allocation, and security planning. Long-term demographic shifts contributed to the development of North Korea's centralized control and South Korea's emphasis on economic modernization and social cohesion. The Korean War, therefore, was not only a military and political conflict, but also a profound human catastrophe, shaping the population, society, and culture of the peninsula for generations to come. The Korean War inflicted profound psychological trauma on soldiers, both from the intensity of combat and the protracted nature of the conflict. Unlike World War II, the Korean War was characterized by static front lines, attritional battles, and extreme environmental conditions, creating prolonged stress and fatigue. Soldiers faced relentless artillery barrages, sniper fire, and ambushes, with the psychological burden amplified by harsh winters, rugged mountainous terrain, and inadequate shelter. The constant threat of death or injury, combined with the uncertainty of victory, contributed to widespread mental strain. Many soldiers experienced symptoms now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, including nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, and emotional numbing. The nature of the fighting, particularly the repeated hill battles and back-and-forth territorial exchanges, created feelings of futility and frustration. Unit cohesion, camaraderie, and leadership played crucial roles in mitigating psychological distress, but even well-led and well-trained units suffered from cumulative trauma. Combat stress was compounded by extended tours of duty, with limited rest or rotation, leaving soldiers physically exhausted and mentally vulnerable. The psychological toll was also influenced by cultural and ideological factors. Soldiers from South Korea, North Korea, China, and UN forces were all operating within differing military cultures, with varying expectations regarding endurance, obedience, and coping with adversity. Propaganda, political indoctrination, and peer pressure shaped responses to stress, yet the human mind's limits were consistently tested. The Korean War highlighted the need for mental health awareness, support structures, and post-combat rehabilitation, laying the groundwork for modern military psychiatry and the recognition of combat-related psychological disorders. Civilians endured intense trauma during the Korean War, experiencing violence, displacement, loss, and instability on an unprecedented scale. Cities were shelled, homes destroyed, and communities uprooted, exposing populations to prolonged insecurity. Families were separated by the DMZ, refugee movements, and front lines, leaving many without knowledge of the fate of loved ones. Children were particularly vulnerable, often witnessing death, suffering, and destruction firsthand, shaping their psychological development and future resilience. Civilians experienced a combination of acute stress and long-term trauma. Survivors reported chronic anxiety, depression, and feelings of helplessness, while societal norms and coping mechanisms were disrupted by displacement and resource scarcity. The sudden collapse of social structures, schools, markets, and community organizations further exacerbated mental distress. Women, often responsible for protecting children and maintaining households amidst chaos, faced extreme psychological and physical burdens. Refugee camps, while offering temporary safety, were overcrowded, lacked privacy, and exposed inhabitants to additional social stressors, compounding the mental health crisis. The long-term societal impact of this trauma was significant. Entire generations grew up with memories of war, loss, and insecurity, shaping attitudes toward authority, security, and national identity. Cultural expressions, literature, art, and oral history served as both a coping mechanism and a means of preserving memory, reflecting the psychological imprint of the war. Communities struggled to rebuild trust, cohesion, and social stability, highlighting the enduring effects of conflict on civilian mental health and societal resilience. Both Koreas implemented strategies to cope with the psychological aftermath of the war, though approaches differed significantly due to political ideology. In South Korea, societal coping mechanisms included community rebuilding, religious organizations, and educational initiatives emphasizing resilience, patriotism, and recovery. Public commemorations and memorials provided spaces for collective mourning and remembrance, helping communities process trauma while fostering a shared sense of identity. Mental health support was initially limited, but over time veterans organizations, hospitals, and social services began addressing the psychological needs of soldiers and civilians, setting the stage for more comprehensive post-war mental health programs. In North Korea, psychological coping was largely shaped by the state, which framed the war as a heroic struggle against imperialist aggression. Propaganda, education, and public ceremonies emphasized sacrifice, loyalty, and national unity, reinforcing collective identity and channeling trauma into ideological conformity. While this approach suppressed open discussion of psychological distress, it served to maintain societal stability and morale, ensuring the population remained aligned with the regime's objectives. The Korean War demonstrated that recovery from trauma requires both individual resilience and societal structures. Rehabilitation, education, memorialization, and community support helped survivors adapt and rebuild, though the psychological scars persisted for decades. The conflict highlighted the profound human cost of war, showing that military victory or territorial gains cannot fully mitigate the mental and emotional toll experienced by soldiers and civilians. Lessons from Korea influenced subsequent approaches to trauma care, veteran support, and civilian mental health in conflict zones worldwide, emphasizing the need for holistic, long-term strategies for post-war recovery. The Korean War was one of the first conflicts to be extensively covered by modern mass media, shaping global perception in real time. Newsreels, radio broadcasts, newspapers, and photographs brought images of the front lines into homes around the world. Journalists from countries involved in the conflict reported from both South Korea and international positions, offering detailed accounts of battles, troop movements, and civilian suffering. The immediacy of media coverage influenced public opinion, political decisions, and military strategy, marking a significant evolution in the relationship between war and media. Television coverage, though in its infancy, played a notable role in shaping public perception in the United States and Europe. Graphic images of bombed cities, refugee columns, and wounded soldiers illustrated the war's brutality and human cost. The media highlighted the struggle of civilians caught in the crossfire and the resilience of military forces, influencing support for military operations and humanitarian aid. However, coverage was often selective, reflecting both governmental oversight and logistical challenges in reporting from contested or dangerous areas. The Korean War demonstrated the power of media to influence both domestic and international perspectives. News coverage affected public sentiment, sometimes fueling anti-communist fervor or, alternatively, criticism of military policies. The widespread dissemination of images and stories contributed to a sense of global engagement, even among populations geographically distant from the conflict. Media became a tool not only for reporting events but also for shaping narrative, reinforcing ideology, and mobilizing political and humanitarian responses, setting precedents for how modern wars would be mediated to the public. Propaganda played a central role during the Korean War, used by all parties to maintain morale, justify military actions, and influence both domestic and international audiences. In North Korea, state-controlled propaganda emphasized resistance against imperialist aggression and celebrated victories against superior forces. Posters, radio broadcasts, and newspapers glorified soldiers' sacrifices and framed the war as a heroic struggle led by the leadership. Educational programs and cultural performances reinforced ideological loyalty, portraying the conflict as both a national and moral imperative. In South Korea, propaganda focused on defending sovereignty, resisting communism, and supporting the United Nations mission. The government, supported by U.S. advisors, used posters, films, and radio broadcasts to bolster civilian and military morale. Soldiers were praised for bravery. Civilians were encouraged to participate in reconstruction and civil defense, and anti-communist narratives permeated public life. The messages stressed unity, vigilance, and the threat posed by the North, creating a climate of both fear and patriotic commitment. The United States and other UN member nations also used propaganda strategically. Newsreels, radio programs, and printed materials depicted the conflict in moral terms, framing South Korea as a democracy under threat from communist expansion. Propaganda reinforced public support for military intervention, humanitarian aid, and diplomatic efforts. The interplay of media coverage and state-directed messaging shaped international understanding of the war, illustrating how information became a battlefield in itself influencing perception, policy, and popular opinion during and after the conflict. The Korean War's extensive media coverage and propaganda campaigns had lasting effects on global perception of the conflict and the Cold War. In Western nations, the war was largely understood as a struggle between democracy and communism, reinforcing the binary worldview that dominated international politics. Public opinion, shaped by both independent journalism and government messaging, supported U.S. and UN intervention while often underestimating the complexity of Korean society, local politics, and historical grievances. Conversely, in communist states, including China, the Soviet Union, and North Korea, the war was portrayed as a triumph of socialist solidarity against imperialist aggression. State-controlled media emphasized the valor of communist soldiers, the unity of Allied forces, and the moral righteousness of resisting foreign intervention. These narratives helped legitimize domestic policies, mobilize populations, and justify the long-term militarization of society. The Korean War demonstrated that public perception could be managed, manipulated, and weaponized, with media and propaganda serving as critical tools for shaping understanding and behavior. The conflict set precedents for how future wars would be communicated globally, highlighting the intertwined nature of military, political, and informational strategies. It also underscored the importance of critical media literacy, as governments and organizations recognized the power of images, stories, and messaging to influence opinion, both at home and abroad. The Korean War was a landmark conflict in the history of military aviation, marking the first large-scale use of jet aircraft in combat. Jet fighters such as the US F-86 Sabre and the Soviet-designed MiG-15 engaged in intense aerial duels over the Korean peninsula, a confrontation famously known as the MiG Alley battles. These engagements demonstrated the transformative impact of speed, altitude, and maneuverability on air combat, establishing a new era of air warfare. Pilots had to master advanced tactics, radar use, and gunnery, all while facing extreme weather conditions and treacherous terrain. Close air support became a critical component of battlefield strategy. Aircraft were used to strike enemy positions, disrupt supply lines, and provide reconnaissance for ground troops. Helicopters, including the Bell H-13 and Sikorsky models, were deployed extensively for medical evacuation, supply transport, and observation, revolutionizing battlefield logistics and casualty management. The introduction of air mobility allowed forces to reach previously inaccessible areas, evacuate wounded soldiers more rapidly, and improve situational awareness, giving both sides a tactical edge. Air power also had strategic significance. Bombing campaigns targeted industrial infrastructure, transportation networks, and supply depots, aiming to weaken the enemy's capacity to sustain combat operations. However, these campaigns also had profound humanitarian consequences, contributing to civilian displacement and casualties. The Korean War illustrated the dual-edged nature of air power, a force multiplier in combat but a source of widespread destruction, highlighting the ethical, tactical, and strategic dilemmas of modern aerial warfare. The Korean War underscored the critical role of communications and intelligence in modern warfare. Rapidly changing front lines, combined operations among multinational forces, and the threat of Chinese intervention demanded reliable communication networks. Field telephones, radio transmitters, and signal units allowed commanders to coordinate artillery, infantry, and air support across challenging terrain. Despite technological limitations, effective communication was essential for maintaining cohesion, directing reinforcements, and executing complex maneuvers such as the Inchon Landing. Intelligence gathering and analysis also proved decisive. Aerial reconnaissance, signal interception, and human intelligence networks provided insights into enemy troop movements, supply lines, and intentions. Accurate intelligence allowed UN forces to anticipate Chinese offensives, adjust defensive positions, and conduct counterattacks. Conversely, the Chinese and North Korean forces developed their own intelligence strategies, emphasizing stealth, mobility, and surprise to compensate for technological disadvantages. The war demonstrated that intelligence and communication were force multipliers, as successful operations often depended as much on information superiority as on firepower. Furthermore, the Korean War accelerated innovation in electronic warfare, code-breaking, and battlefield coordination. Lessons learned during the conflict influenced military doctrine worldwide, highlighting the importance of real-time information, networked command structures, and integrated intelligence for operational success. These advances not only shaped military effectiveness in Korea, but also laid the groundwork for future Cold War conflicts, where technological and informational superiority became as crucial as conventional arms. The Korean War marked significant advancements in battlefield medicine and logistical organization. The use of helicopters for medical evacuation, pioneered extensively during the conflict, dramatically improved survival rates for wounded soldiers. Casualties could be transported quickly from front lines to field hospitals, reducing mortality from hemorrhage, infection, and shock. Mobile Army surgical hospitals, MASH units, were deployed near combat zones, providing advanced surgical care, triage, and stabilization before further evacuation. This innovation saved countless lives and transformed military medical doctrine. Logistics were equally critical, supplying multinational forces across rugged terrain, harsh winters, and under enemy threat required meticulous planning and coordination. Railways, roads, ports, and air transport were leveraged to maintain the flow of ammunition, food, fuel, and medical supplies. UN forces had to integrate diverse supply chains from multiple nations, balancing standardization with flexibility to meet the needs of rapidly moving units. The Chinese and North Korean forces relied on human porters, local resources, and improvisation, highlighting contrasting approaches to logistics that shaped operational effectiveness. The Korean War demonstrated that technological and logistical innovation could directly influence combat outcomes. Helicopters, advanced communications, and efficient medical evacuation reduced casualties, improved troop morale, and enhanced operational sustainability. The conflict established enduring lessons in integrating technology, logistics, and human resources in modern warfare, influencing military planning, doctrine, and innovation for decades to come. Beyond combat, these advancements had lasting effects on civilian emergency response, medical practice, and disaster management worldwide, illustrating the broader societal impact of military innovation. The Korean War holds immense strategic and military significance as the first major conflict of the Cold War. Unlike World War II, where alliances were clear and ideological stakes widely agreed upon, Korea represented the beginning of a protracted global struggle between communism and democracy, which would dominate international relations for decades. The war demonstrated the necessity of rapid deployment, coalition warfare, and integration of multinational forces in a complex geopolitical environment. Military planners and historians often highlight the innovations in combined arms operations, jet-air combat, and mechanized infantry coordination as defining features of the war. The conflict served as a proving ground for new technologies, including helicopters, jet fighters, improved artillery coordination, and real-time communications, which would become staples of modern warfare. Moreover, Korea showed the limitations of technological superiority without proper strategy, intelligence, and adaptation to terrain and climate, underscoring that human judgment and logistics remained decisive factors in combat outcomes. The war also emphasized the importance of political-military coordination. Military actions could not be divorced from diplomatic objectives, as the threat of escalation to nuclear conflict influenced decisions at every level. Commanders had to navigate not only the battlefield but also the broader strategic context, balancing tactical gains with geopolitical risks. The Korean War set precedents for limited wars under nuclear shadow, highlighting the complexities of intervention, escalation, and coalition management. A lesson that resonated in Vietnam, the Middle East, and other conflicts throughout the Cold War and beyond. The Korean War offered a wealth of lessons for military, political, and humanitarian planning. One of the primary takeaways was the necessity of preparation for limited, protracted conflicts where objectives are politically constrained. The war demonstrated that even technologically advanced militaries could be bogged down in stalemate if strategic, political, and human factors were misaligned. Lessons in coalition coordination, logistics, and intelligence gathering became foundational for subsequent U.S. and UN operations worldwide. Globally, the war reinforced the principle of collective security under the UN, establishing a model for international intervention in the face of aggression. It underscored the challenges of enforcing peace, maintaining international legitimacy, and balancing sovereignty with moral responsibility. Countries involved learned that political objectives often require integration with military capabilities and humanitarian considerations, especially in conflicts where civilian populations are directly affected. The war also served as a stark reminder of the human cost of ideological confrontation. Millions of soldiers and civilians suffered casualties, displacement, and trauma. The legacy of the Korean War highlighted the need for post-conflict reconstruction, refugee assistance, mental health support, and reconciliation programs. These lessons continue to inform modern conflict management, emphasizing that military victory alone cannot resolve deep-seated political, social, and humanitarian issues. The Korean War remains highly relevant today, more than 70 years after the armistice. The division of the Korean Peninsula continues to shape regional security, diplomacy, and international relations. The DMZ remains one of the most fortified borders in the world, symbolizing the unresolved tensions between North and South Korea. Periodic military provocations, nuclear developments, and diplomatic engagements reflect the war's lasting influence on global security policy. The conflict also serves as a historical lens for understanding the Cold War and contemporary geopolitics. It demonstrated the consequences of ideological confrontation, the complexities of foreign intervention, and the enduring impact of war on societies and economies. Both Koreas were profoundly shaped by the war. South Korea developed a strong military, resilient economy, and democratic institutions, while North Korea became a heavily militarized, centrally controlled state, emphasizing self-reliance and ideological loyalty. Finally, the Korean War remains a cautionary tale and a source of reflection for scholars, policymakers, and the public. Its lessons about preparedness, diplomacy, coalition building, and human resilience continue to resonate in contemporary conflicts. The war's legacy underscores that even limited wars have profound and lasting consequences, and understanding this conflict is essential to navigating both historical knowledge and present-day challenges. In sum, the Korean War, often called the Forgotten War, is in reality a conflict whose lessons, consequences, and relevance endure, shaping not only Korea but the global order in profound and lasting ways. And that concludes our full journey through the Korean War, a conflict that reshaped a nation, impacted global politics, and left a legacy still felt today. We've explored the battles, the strategies, the human suffering, and the lessons learned, reminding us that war is never just about borders or politics, but about people, families, and the choices that shape history. The moral of the story? History teaches us vigilance, resilience, and the importance of remembering even the conflicts that history might try to forget. Understanding the Korean War helps us grasp the complexities of our modern world and why peace, diplomacy, and understanding are more important than ever. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to History Teller YT. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a journey through history with us. Join us again for more untold stories, forgotten wars, and fascinating historical events that shaped the world. Until next time, remember, history is more than dates and battles. It's the story of humanity itself.